The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters. Greetings and welcome back to the Personal Safety Show. Once again, this is Marcus Melnick from Firearm Mentor and Stress 2 Logic, your host, and we are continuing the conversation with Travis Hooker, who is a retired lieutenant from the Elgin Police Department and is one of the principals at CDO Executives, where we're talking about special populations. Specifically, we are in the middle of talking about the differences in the deaf community when interacting with law enforcement. Specifically, we were talking about how when I was growing up, the people I interacted with who were deaf would bring a little notepad with them when they went out to eat or they had to interact with anyone, and that's how they would communicate. It would be in writing. They'd hand the person the pad of paper or the little notepad, and the other person would respond in writing, and that's how they communicated. Today, we have electronics. It's a little bit different, so we are going to jump right back in talking about that pencil and paper, quote, app, which was me being kidding when I said that.
And I agree with the pencil and paper idea. Let's just say we're doing a traffic stop, or it's something non-critical where we aren't taking away somebody's freedom of movement. But once we're going to take somebody into custody, I think we need to move beyond that pencil and paper. And another benefit is when I can get somebody in, whether it be ASL or Greek or Hebrew, whatever language it may be, if I can get somebody on the line that they can see, like a FaceTime, like I said, through this app, that's a comfort to talk to somebody in your native language that maybe looks like you, has similar life experience as you, and can help de-escalate situations merely by having someone from their same or similar religious or cultural background. And there is a subculture within the deaf community, like I said. So those little idiosyncrasies that are part of our subcultures, depending on our background, are important to bring in to help accomplish our lawful objective with the least amount of force possible and with the least pushback as possible. And to ultimately, you can build a community partnership even if you have to make an arrest. So all of those are benefits of using native language speakers versus pencil and paper. But yes, grocery store, somebody comes in and at the front desk and has a question.
Right.
We have at Elgin, we have a laptop a laptop up there that we can pull up. In the jail, we have the laptop. In investigations, and all of the laptops or the iPads have that language line option. So it makes it easier for communicating. And then an attorney is going to really have a problem if you interview somebody in their non-native language. How do you know your words translated correctly if you're kind of spitballing it? And did they understand Miranda fully when you didn't give it to them in their native tongue? So it can help head off those situations for motions to quash.
Perfect. I would like to segue into a different community that is going to have different issues, and that is the autism spectrum community, which
Yes.
Autism seems to be a lot more prevalent today. It could be because the diagnosis criteria changed. It could be a variety of different things. So what sort of issues are there with people who are on the spectrum?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And you're right. And so since 2000, the number of diagnoses has gone up 178%. It's grown quite a lot. There's some question on, are there more autistic people today than there were, or are we just diagnosing it better?
Right.
Probably the latter. Additionally, what used to be termed as Asperger's disorder, Asperger's syndrome, is part of autism now. They don't separate it out. So, you took in those numbers, and so that's going to increase it as well. And that's actually where I'm at right now, is I'm teaching a class down in St. Louis area on autism and law enforcement interactions. So the numbers have increased, whether that be because of better diagnoses or not, either way. And we've had, sadly, a lot of use of force incidents that have become national news based on misunderstanding, miscommunication. Often autistic people will show what the officer believes to be clues of non-responsiveness or evasiveness lack of eye contact, racking, stimming, where they're, it's hard to describe stimming over a phone, but a physical activity they do to help relieve stress.
Like shaking their hands in the air.
Flapping. Yep, that's one
flapping.
of them. And then, responding to calls with lights and sirens, or if you pull somebody over that's, maybe in the passenger seat is who's autistic, the lights may be have higher sensitivity to lights, similar to persons with epilepsy. And then you have high functioning people who are autistic that are driving cars. And so just things to keep in mind. Again, I'm not thinking officers should not put their safety secondary, but just knowing these things before you go into a situation. Again, encouraging agencies to establish programs such as family finder programs, and interacting with the autistic community to better build those bridges. And the more, again, we interact with people that have a different background, a physical and mental health disability, a different gender identity, sexual orientation, religious background, the more it helps us reduce our implicit biases, which then, again, it means we have less chance of explicit biases.
Very good. And one community which I've started to get involved in and research is LGBTQ plus. You had said that you went to the Pride Parade in Buffalo Grove. I saw your car and I definitely waved to you that year. It still is, although the route changed, walking distance from my home. So
very cool.
Yeah, so I definitely know the area. I very well know the people who are in charge of that. So what are some issues? Well, let me before I ask that, I want to say it was back in the 60s or 70s. There was a gay nightclub and the police went in and beat the crap out of everyone. And that kind of puts a little bit of a division between law enforcement and the LGBTQ community, which I don't believe exists anymore. At least nobody goes in and beats up everyone. So what are some of the issues that this community faces when dealing with law enforcement? Take it away.
Okay, so that's a twofold answer. I'm going to start with what you brought up, which was called the Stonewall Riots, which happened in June of 1969. And that's what people know or hear about or have a fluttering of. That's the history of gay pride, is based on police brutality. It's partially true, but in the 60s, if anybody's ever read or seen the movie Serpico, not that it was right, I don't agree at all, but it was about police graft and being paid off more than it was about a gay club. So Stonewall Inn was not an official bar. It was a social club. They did not have a liquor license, and they were owned by the Genovese crime family. The Genovese crime family bought it and ran it because they could sell them alcohol at an exorbitant rate because they owned the building and they couldn't get a liquor license. So they took advantage of them that way. They also took advantage of them by sometimes crime figures would take pictures of people coming in and out of the bar and say, hey, listen, give me $500 or $200, or I'm going to show this picture to your wife and kids or your boss. You got to remember, at that time, you couldn't hold a civil service job if you were openly gay. Being gay was illegal in most states. Dancing with someone of the same sex was illegal in New York. Holding hands with someone of the same sex was illegal in New York. Kissing somebody of the same sex was illegal in New York. So all of those, and not just New York, but I mention it because that's where it took place. So the Genovese crime family paid the cops off, and anytime the cops were going to do a liquor raid there, they would call the crime family and say, hey, we're going to be down there tomorrow between 7 and 8. And so the crime family would call the bar or go down to the bar, and they'd hide all the alcohol. They'd make sure everybody was dressed gender appropriate at the time. So men were dressed as men, women were dressed as women. There was nobody dancing of the same sex. Police would come in and it wasn't a problem. So they did one of these raids and the police wanted more money. So they reached back out and said, hey, we need more money. And the crime family said, no, we're not going to pay you. This is what we pay you already. And so 3 days after they did an announced raid, they got a search warrant and did an unannounced raid. And during this unannounced raid, the second in 3 days, this is where the community was like, we just got raided. And the police would take men dressed as women or those who appeared to be masculine women into the bathroom and physically look at their genitalia to determine their sex. That's unacceptable. And they had a ton of pushback from within the community on that. They were very heavy-handed when they went in. And the people decided to fight back, if you will. It became known as the Stonewall Riots. It lasted for 3 days. There were no serious injuries. There was nobody killed, but it kind of grew from there into this 3-day thing. So with that, 1 year later, and they held the, I believe it was called the Christopher Park Day of Remembrance, which was the first Pride event. So the Christopher Park Stonewall event in June led to June becoming Pride Month, led to June where all the June Pride parades come from. So when people push back from the community and say police shouldn't be involved because it started with the police doing this, knowing the full story is important, because yes, but I don't define as a police officer that, ever took graft or money, and things have changed a lot since then. There's been tremendous legislation update, United States Supreme Court rulings, decriminalized homosexuality in all the states. The right to marry someone of the same gender is the law of the land based on the Supreme Court ruling. Protections under the 1964 Civil Rights Act all apply to LGBTQ persons now. So just understanding the full background of it, where it came from and how far we've come, is important. And just because somebody is a police officer or works in law enforcement or first responder doesn't mean they should have to suppress that part of themselves if they're also part of the LGBTQ community. We need to be accepting on both sides and hopefully reducing those biases on both sides of the fence.
Terrific. There is a new trend in law enforcement, and it's starting to take hold, where social workers are also dispatched with police officers to it. I believe the program evolved out of domestic disputes. So do you teach any programs on sending out a social worker along with a police officer to these marginalized communities?
Yeah, and so that's something I think Elgin did a tremendous job on. I think I have my phone upside down. There we go. Maybe you can hear me better?
Yes.
Elgin created a program and then modeled it after New York. We had a critical incident in Elgin where an officer was involved in a deadly force encounter with a person who was armed with an edged weapon after being barricaded in a vehicle. So I think Elgin took that and said, okay, how can we work to reduce this chance of happening again? Not that the officer was incorrect in his use of force, but there are things we can put in place to maybe slow things down, and so the person couldn't just jump out of a car at us after we've been there for several hours negotiating. So they sent some officers and our SWAT team leader to England to learn how to best deal with people with edged weapons when police in the UK, for the most part, don't carry firearms. I took some tools and trades from there and then went to New York City, and New York City has emergency services detail, and learned some tools and techniques and bought equipment that allowed Elgin to create a similar type program. So the program we have in Elgin is called the Emergency Services Detail, but they are tied to we have a unit in the Elgin Police Department where there's police officers, detectives that are assigned, and social workers that also are in this office. It's a special unit. CCSU is what it's called, and I can't think of what that means off the top of my head. And then we also have someone down there that if mental health call comes in through the 911 center, it can get transferred to this mental health professional who can talk to the person on the phone rather than send the police out if we don't know the address or it doesn't rise to that level. So with the program in Elgin, there are 2 trained officers that this is their secondary duty. They work a shift or are a detective or a supervisor. They do something else most of the time, but they work a couple days, so it's on a different rotation schedule with 2 officers, and they drive a truck that has things in it that historically haven't been used by the police, but to help reduce chances of somebody jumping out at us. So like if somebody was in a car, for example, and they were threatening self-harm, nobody else was in the car, just to slow things down so they couldn't pop open the door and charge at us, they have tie the doors off to slow the person down. They have a low pressure water fire extinguisher that they can use to spray somebody in the face if they need to rush in on them. It's just water, but it's that startle effect will allow the police to take control of the situation. They have a Y bar, so if a person is being threatening and we're in a standoff situation, they can come at the person and it kind of just pins them to the wall. It literally looks like a giant U, and it's made out of metal, and it has on the the tips like what you'd find on the bottom of chairs, so it won't skewer somebody. So they have these special tools, but their most special tool they have with them is a licensed clinical social worker or a mental health professional. And so they respond to crisis calls for mental health. So we have suicidal subjects, if we have mental health disorder subjects, if we have emotionally distraught person calls, they will respond to those. They're not the primary. We still send the regular officer over to take the report, but that mental health professional can make an on-scene assessment on if that person needs to go to the hospital or not. If, there's certain criteria that we know that they have to go to the hospital. They're threatening self-harm. They admit they're threatening self-harm. They do it in front of us. They have a loved one that says they're threatening self-harm, and we can substantiate it, then yes, they have to go to the hospital. But let's say it doesn't rise to that level, this clinical social worker can do an on-scene assessment. And additionally, if we have a suicidal prisoner, which is not uncommon, they can go up to our jail and do the assessment. And then from there, we have moved towards ambulance transports to hospitals. It is not a criminal matter. Right. So while we are there to keep the peace, we don't need to criminalize or continue to marginalize this community by putting them in the back of a police car with handcuffs on for a non-criminal offense. It just helps build the fear on both ends. So we try to utilize ambulance services as much as possible to transport for care of mental health. That's a brief discussion of the program, but yes, I'm a big advocate of those co-response. I'm not an advocate of social workers going out on their own on crisis calls without the police, but having the police there, kind of in the background just to make sure everybody's safe can be good as if, the department does it and does it right, has policy and trains on it. Collaborative Crisis Unit, that's what CCSU stands for.
Okay. Well, I'm very pleased to hear you say that, because I was consulting with a religious institution who had someone enter the building and he was high on something and acting all goofy, and there was no danger at all, but it made a lot of people uncomfortable. And they asked me after the incident, what should we have done? Should we have called the police? And I said, no, but you should have called for an ambulance because maybe this person needed help. And so I totally am 100% with you on that. What final thoughts can you share regarding criminal justice, CDO, how police officers can better interact with these marginalized communities? Take it away, Travis.
Well, a couple of things. I would like to say that the better we do on building these partnerships, the better we can do on recruiting some of these people to be part of our organizations. Police departments right now are showing that when I took the test, 800 people stood in line. We'll be lucky now to give out 100 applications, and we're testing multiple times a year because we just aren't getting the number of candidates that pass all the background and written tests. So if we can bring people in from a marginalized community, right, somebody who is Jewish or somebody who is Hindu, Sikh, and now they become a police officer or a civilian employee. There are lots of high-functioning or even medium-functioning people from the autistic community that could be within your agency and take on a civilian role. And to partner with groups that are part of the deaf community, to have them as a resource for responding to critical incidents and having those tools in your toolbox, I think is of most importance, is just knowing what you have in your community, liaising with outside partners, and helping to best connect social services, including police, with the community and help de-escalate situations, reduce use of forces, and better interactions with their community. CDO executives, we offer a lot of different training programs and different courses, as well as policy oversight. Depends really what the agency, whether it be private or public, is seeking. It's all within that same wheelhouse, if you will. We can be reached at cdoexecutives.com. So if anybody wants to check that out, please do. And then the future, I know a lot of people discuss the current political climate, and I'm not discussing politics other than to say that whoever is elected really isn't going to change a lot of these issues on a state level, because most of them fall within a states' rights issue. Or the federal case law comes from a Supreme Court ruling, and those don't happen too often, and they take years to get to that level. So I know there's been some pushback recently on DEI being an ugly word. If you don't think about it as diversity training and more like how do I better interact with people, then that's a good name to give it. Call it whatever you want. It's not about pushing an agenda. It's not about putting our safety secondary. It's about connecting with community and what tools do we have in place at 2 a.m. when an officer encounters somebody from one of these marginalized communities and needs to get their compliance to best serve them. How do I go about doing that? It's always when it comes up is 2 a.m, and having those tools in your toolbox and having policy in place that you can readily access in training will help both the person that's being stopped or interviewed by the police reduce their stress level and the officer's stress level.
Terrific. Ladies and gentlemen, Travis Hooker from CDO Executives. Travis, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I want my listeners to know that this is my dream, teaching people about safety. If it weren't for you, if it weren't for my listeners, I couldn't live my dream. So on behalf of my family and myself, I want to thank each and every one of you for allowing me to live my dream. And I also want to continue to live my dream, and I'm excited to continue to spread the word of safety. Recently, I began a new service as a conference keynote speaker. So if anyone would like for me to speak at future events, or if anyone knows of an introduction or would like to discuss how we can work with one another, I'd love to do just that. The keynote speaking website is www.stress2logic.com. That is STRESS 2LOGIC.com. If you're aware of any conference speaking engagements where you'd like to have me speak, I'd love an introduction. You can always share my electronic business card, which is Marcus Melnick, MarcusMelnick.com. Now, back to the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are encouraged as I am as law enforcement is evolving to address these marginalized communities. And I want to share some news relating to firearms. So last weekend, the CTA had 4 people that were shot dead. And if you remember the last episode, I talked about Shot Spotter, or it's not exactly called Shot Spotter, but it is a system where people can look at video cameras and determine if there is a firearm on CTA. That's not been implemented system-wide yet, but Brandon Johnston, who I thought was better than this, started to place blame for this shooting. Brandon Johnston used a ribbon-cutting ceremony at a school to pontificate politically. He was talking about how guns are still accessible to people that shouldn't get them. Don't disagree with that. But he called the violence a tragedy and an example of why more gun laws are needed. What do we have? 18,000 gun laws, and he just wants to layer it on top. So he says out of control is how gun access in the U.S. is. Apparently he does not understand the FOID system. What really got me going was this quote. Brandon Johnston said, quote, "It's very sickening, of course, that we have a Republican Congress that refused to cooperate and work with the sensible people of this country to ensure there is real gun control." Boy, I have a lot of choice words for you, Mayor Johnson, but I'm not going to do them because I am a gentleman. But seriously, educate yourself. This is what was ridiculous was you blaming a Republican Congress or a Democratic Congress. It doesn't matter. What happened to individual responsibility for committing crime? That is where the blame should be placed, on the criminal, not on an inanimate object, not on a political party, no matter what political party you belong to. Interestingly, on a parallel trope, unrelated but also talking about the CTA, there was a federal case this week that said that the ban on carrying concealed guns on the CTA and Metra has been ruled unconstitutional. In Rockford, a federal judge ruled that the Illinois law banning concealed carry permit holders from carrying their guns on public transportation is unconstitutional. U.S. District Judge Ian Johnston, another Johnston, issued a ruling on Friday that allowed 4 men from the Chicago suburbs to carry concealed firearms on buses and trains. Benjamin Sokenthal of DeKalb and Mark Robluski of Woodridge are both permitted to carry guns on Metro trains and property as a result of this ruling, while Joseph Vessel of LaGrange and Douglas Winston of Waukegan can bring their guns on Metra and the Chicago Transit Authority. The judge found Attorney General Kwame Raoul, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox, and DuPage County State's Attorney Robert Berlin failed to meet their burden to show an American tradition of firearm regulation at the time of the founding that would allow Illinois to prohibit those who hold concealed carry permits from carrying concealed handguns for self-defense on public transportation. The judge relied on a 2022 Supreme Court ruling in the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which struck down that state's law requiring people to show proper cause to get a gun and established a new constitutional test, the requirement that gun laws are consistent with regulations in place at the time the Second Amendment was written. The Rockford-based judge rejected the argument from attorneys for the state that previous laws regulating firearms on railroads were relevant since they are private entities. The task before this court is to decipher whether public transport can be analogous to schools or government buildings, including legislative assemblies, polling places, and courthouses, or to some other sensitive place if state officials are able to identify one. When determining if public transit should be considered a sensitive place, somewhere the Supreme Court, under the 2008 District of Columbia versus Heller ruling, considers gun regulations constitutional, but the judge was unconvinced by state theories. I want to caution my listeners, before you actually carry on public transportation, understand this ruling only applies to the plaintiffs, not to the general public. That will have to shake out in future court cases. Tune in next week for another awesome episode.
The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters.